Falcon ruled with fear. When a new cocaine pipeline hit Liverpool's streets, old alliances shattered, betrayals turned friends into enemies, and the city's red brick estates became a battlefield. This is the story of the war that changed Liverpool forever. Liverpool's red brick estates had always carried a certain rhythm, a pulse that locals knew well. Children played in the narrow courtyards, elderly men leaned on railings to watch the world go by, and the faint hum of everyday life seemed to stretch from one street to the next. By night, the estates usually fell silent, save for the occasional siren or the distant bark of a dog. It was the kind of quiet that lulled most residents into a sense of safety, a quiet that suggested nothing terrible could reach them here. Until the first whispers began. The whispers started in small, almost meaningless ways. A blacked-out van parked for hours in the wrong place, new faces wandering streets that had long been familiar, and the faint hum of conversations that stopped the moment anyone approached. Then came the rumors. A shipment of cocaine had arrived in Liverpool. A pipeline that promised wealth beyond anything the city's crime syndicates had seen before. For decades, organized crime in the city had maintained a fragile balance. Lines had been drawn in invisible ink, territories respected, grudges kept private. The arrival of the cocaine pipeline changed everything. Falcon, a figure known only to those who dealt with him in the shadows, was the first to recognize the opportunity. His reputation was built on precision and fear, a man who never wasted moves and who kept his ambition tightly wrapped. Hidden behind a calm exterior, he saw in the new shipment a chance not just to expand his influence, but to reshape the entire criminal landscape of Liverpool. The streets could become his, brick by brick, if he played his cards right. Across the city, the dock rats, a syndicate with deep roots and a sense of old-fashioned loyalty, viewed Falcon's rise with suspicion. They had survived decades by following the unspoken rules of the estates, relying on alliances and respect rather than sheer force. To them, the pipeline was not just an opportunity, it was a threat. Their families, their friends, the streets they had grown up on, were all at risk if Falcon succeeded. And unlike him, they were not accustomed to moving quickly. They preferred patience, strategy, and the security of knowing every face in their territory. By the first week's end, tension had begun to crack the surface of everyday life. Burned-out cars appeared on side streets, abandoned and smoking as though the city itself had begun to reject them. Notices of warnings were left for anyone who might think of crossing the wrong person, their messages written in the simplest, scariest form, a symbol of an X, a threat that required no explanation. Locals felt it in the air, a quiet pressure that made them glance over their shoulders more often and question the trustworthiness of even familiar neighbors. The real violence, though, was not yet in full view. It was the undercurrent. The men who now patrolled corners with knives tucked into jackets, the drivers who took secret routes at odd hours, the silent meetings held behind closed doors that signaled the beginning of a war nobody could stop. The pipeline had brought with it more than cocaine. It brought ambition, greed, and a hunger for control that neither the old guard nor the new would tolerate. And so, the estates braced themselves. Children still played, and shopkeepers still unlocked their doors in the morning, but there was an invisible tension, a sense that something monumental was unfolding, just beyond the gaze of ordinary life. Liverpool's red bricks, once symbols of stability, now stood as silent witnesses to the coming storm, each one a potential marker in a city about to be reshaped by violence and betrayal. The first moves had been made, and though the citizens didn't yet know it, their lives would never feel the same again. The war for Liverpool's cocaine corridor had begun. The first real blood spilled into Liverpool streets before most residents even realized the war had escalated. It started in the dead of night, when a warehouse belonging to the dock rats erupted in flames so fierce that the glow could be seen from blocks away. Smoke twisted into the sky like a warning, curling over the red brick roofs of the estate. By morning, scorched walls and melted metal littered the courtyard, leaving behind nothing but ash and the faint smell of destruction. No one claimed responsibility, but whispers immediately named Falcon's men. The fire was too precise, too calculated to be anything but a message. The old rules no longer apply. After the blaze, fear began to seep into daily life like water through cracked mortar. Streets once familiar became unrecognizable, lined with abandoned cars, empty bottles and the occasional trace of blood. Families began disappearing without explanation, leaving homes in disarray, doors swinging open in the wind, television still playing, as though their occupants had been torn from life mid-routine. Neighbors murmured about a hit list circulating among the gangs, names crossed off with a crimson mark, and anyone could be next. The air carried a tense, unpredictable energy, the kind that made even long-time residents hurry their footsteps and check over their shoulders. The violence escalated methodically, each attack a chess move on the city's grid of streets. Couriers delivering cocaine were gunned down on deserted roads, their vehicles abandoned with bullets riddling the paint. Stairwells in council estates became ambush points, where rival crews waited in the shadows, knives in hand and guns pressed to walls. The red bricks themselves, once symbols of home and safety, were becoming silent witnesses to an increasingly ruthless war. Liverpool's police force struggled to respond. Officers moved cautiously, knowing that one wrong step could make them targets. Each raid yielded fragments of information but never enough to dismantle the networks completely. Syndicate members learned to slip between patrols, changing routes and hiding shipments in places the law rarely looked. It was a game of shadow and smoke, with ordinary citizens trapped in the middle, powerless to stop the tide. Among the chaos, Falcon consolidated his control with terrifying efficiency. His men were trained to strike swiftly and vanish just as fast, leaving nothing but fear in their wake. Meanwhile, the dock rats, shocked by the sudden aggression and relentless precision, tried to regroup. Old alliances frayed, trust eroded by paranoia, and even the strongest lieutenants began doubting one another. The streets, once predictable, now carried an unpredictable tension. Each alley, each corner, each stairwell could hide a gun or an ambush. But even amid this violence, something unexpected began to emerge. Ordinary people, caught in the crossfire, started watching the war with quiet calculation. Some saw opportunities in the confusion. Others tried to shield themselves and their families from the chaos. The red bricks of Liverpool, scarred and blackened from fires and gunshots, became markers of survival, of resilience, and of a city teetering on the edge of breakdown. By the end of the chapter, it was clear that nothing would ever return to normal. The cocaine pipeline had not only brought wealth and ambition, it had unleashed a wave of violence that neither Falcon nor the dock rats could fully control. Liverpool had become a city divided, a labyrinth of fear, and the residents of the estates were learning the hard way that in this war, survival required cunning, courage, and sometimes the willingness to abandon old loyalties. The streets themselves seemed to breathe with tension, every red brick wall a silent witness to a war whose outcome no one could yet predict. Just when Falcon seemed unstoppable, the first real crack appeared in his armor. One of his most trusted lieutenants, a man who had earned a reputation for unwavering loyalty, vanished without a trace. His disappearance was sudden, almost invisible, leaving Falcon with more questions than answers. For years he had relied on this lieutenant to manage key operations, to oversee shipments, and to maintain discipline among the crews. Now, every plan, every carefully orchestrated move, was suddenly vulnerable. Days passed with no sign of him, and Falcon's men grew tense, scanning streets and alleys for any hint of betrayal. Then the lieutenant reappeared, but not in the way anyone expected. He had switched sides, delivering himself and crucial intelligence to the dock rats. Every shipment Falcon planned, every safe house location, every movement of his enforcers was now exposed to his rivals. The betrayal was devastating, a strategic earthquake that rattled the foundations of Falcon's empire. Falcon's reaction was methodical and terrifying. He ordered raids on anyone suspected of sharing information, locking down entire blocks, and sending squads of his men to enforce a brutal version of loyalty. Homes were searched, vehicles stripped, and those caught in his dragnet vanished without warning. The air in the estates grew heavier with fear, suspicion, and uncertainty. No one could be trusted, and even those who had proven themselves over years began questioning their own allegiances. The dock rats, emboldened by the defection, began to strike harder, hitting Falcon's operations with precision. But the shift in power came with its own danger. Falcon's remaining men, feeling trapped and desperate, lashed out in ways that were unpredictable, sometimes targeting neutral parties, sometimes taking unnecessary risks that cost them valuable assets. The once structured war now teetered into chaos. Amid the turmoil, a third force quietly emerged. Smaller crews that had long operated on the periphery of Liverpool's criminal underworld saw an opportunity in the distrust that now defined both Falcon's organization and the dock rats. They formed a loose coalition, calling themselves the Red Hawks, and began consolidating abandoned corners of the estates. Unlike the establishment, calling themselves the Red Hawks, and began consolidating abandoned corners of the estates. Unlike the established syndicates, they were nimble, anonymous, and patient. While Falcon and the dock rats fought each other openly, the Red Hawks slipped into the shadows, claiming territory with minimal attention. The estates themselves seemed to mirror the chaos. Courtyards that had been familiar and safe were now shadowed, suspicious places. Streetlights flickered over cracked pavements, over walls tagged with new symbols marking allegiance or warning. Families who had once ignored the undercurrents of gang rivalry now locked doors, installed cameras, and whispered about the unseen dangers just beyond the familiar red bricks. Fear had become a constant companion, subtle but unyielding. The betrayal also reshaped the psychology of the war. Trust, once the currency of survival, became scarce. Men who had spent decades working together now eyed each other with doubt. Deals were delayed, shipments rerouted, and any hint of cooperation became a potential liability. The red bricks of Liverpool, silent witnesses to the city's history, now bore a new story, one of suspicion, betrayal, and the fragility of power. By the end of this chapter, it was clear that the war had entered a new phase. No single syndicate could claim dominance, and even the most powerful players were vulnerable. Falcon's reputation for invincibility had been shattered. The dock rats were emboldened, but not unassailable, and the Red Hawks had emerged as a silent, calculating threat. Liverpool's cocaine corridor had transformed into a battlefield of shifting alliances and hidden dangers, where survival depended on foresight, ruthlessness, and an uncanny ability to anticipate betrayal. As winter descended on Liverpool, the cocaine corridor had become a frozen battlefield, each street a reminder of the war that refused to end. Falcon's empire, once untouchable, was unraveling in slow, brutal waves. Cornered by betrayals and ambushes, his men acted recklessly, striking at dock rats' strongholds with little strategy and leaving themselves exposed. One botched ambush in a narrow alleyway ended in disaster. Half of Falcon's enforcers were gunned down before they could retreat, their bodies left in the cold, a grim warning to anyone who underestimated the dock rats or the emerging Red Hawks. The dock rats, riding the momentum of the earlier defection, had grown overconfident. Their warehouses, once secure, became targets of meticulous planning by the Red Hawks, who exploited every weakness with almost surgical precision. Shipments vanished, crates of cocaine disappeared overnight, and trusted couriers were ambushed on back streets. The dock rats were learning, painfully and slowly, that the war was no longer just about two old rivals. It had become a three-way fight where unpredictability reigned. Amid the chaos, the Red Hawks moved quietly, but decisively. They claimed territory abandoned by both syndicates, taking over the most strategic corners of the estates, where visibility was limited and escape routes abundant. They were shadows in the night, untraceable, untouchable. By avoiding the open conflict that destroyed others, they gained power without drawing immediate attention, their influence spreading through fear and silence rather than gunfire. In this maelstrom, ordinary residents were caught in the crossfire, becoming involuntary witnesses to the collapse of the old order. Streets once safe for children now bore the scars of firefights, shattered glass, scorch marks, abandoned vehicles, and graffiti marking allegiances. Families fled their homes, leaving behind the red bricks that had once symbolized stability. Business owners boarded windows, wary of both syndicate retaliation and police investigations that had grown relentless yet incomplete. The city felt unrecognizable, a place where every corner could hide a threat, and every shadow might conceal a gun barrel. Falcon, though weakened, remained dangerous. His meticulous mind shifted from domination to survival. He became a ghost, moving between safe houses, relying on encrypted messages and coded signals to direct what remained of his loyal men. But the betrayal had left deeper wounds than any gunfire could inflict. Paranoia spread like wildfire within his ranks. Informants lurked everywhere, and even those who had once been his most trusted lieutenants now questioned every order. Loyalty, it seemed, had become a rare and fragile commodity. The breaking point came when an anonymous tip led police to Falcon's primary safehouse. Inside, investigators discovered weapons caches, stolen shipments, and a network of ledgers detailing payments, contacts, and shipments of cocaine. The documents revealed something even more shocking: ties to corrupt officials who had facilitated parts of the pipeline. Falcon's arrest sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld, leaving a power vacuum the Red Hawks were ready to exploit. But victory did not bring clarity or peace. The Red Hawks now held control of Liverpool's cocaine corridor, yet they understood that dominance in a city scarred by violence was fragile. The estates had been forever changed, trust had been shattered, and fear had become a constant companion. The war had claimed not only lives but the very sense of safety that had once defined Liverpool's red brick neighborhoods. By the end of the winter, the main players had fallen, shifted, or disappeared. Falcon's empire lay in ruins, the dock rats were wounded and cautious, and the Red Hawks ruled the remnants, quietly consolidating power. Yet the war had taught the city a grim lesson. Control of the cocaine corridor came at a price higher than money or loyalty. It demanded vigilance, ruthlessness, and an unflinching willingness to navigate a world where any ally could become a traitor. Liverpool had survived, but the scars of its war would linger in its red bricks for decades, silent witnesses to the fall of titans and the rise of shadows. By the time spring arrived, Liverpool's estates were quieter, but the silence carried a weight heavier than any gunfire. The red bricks, once the backdrop for everyday life, now bore the scars of a brutal war. Blackened walls, bullet holes, and abandoned homes marked the neighborhoods where Falcon, the dock rats, and the Red Hawks had clashed. Families who had fled slowly returned, stepping over rubble and surveying streets that no longer felt familiar. Life went on, but the sense of safety that had defined the estates for generations had been shattered. The Red Hawks now held the cocaine corridor, their power unchallenged yet fragile. They moved through the city like ghosts, their presence known but never seen, consolidating territory with careful, calculated precision. Unlike Falcon or the dock rats, they did not rely on open displays of violence. Their influence came from silence, fear, and the knowledge that in the new Liverpool, no one could be trusted. Every deal required caution. Every alliance was temporary, and the shadow of betrayal hung over every transaction. For the people of Liverpool, the war had left invisible wounds as well as visible ones. Children had grown up watching men vanish in the night, hearing the roar of engines before gunfire erupted, and witnessing homes burned or abandoned. Trust, once taken for granted, was now rare. Communities had fractured, neighbors were cautious of one another, and even routine interactions carried the unspoken question: who could be trusted, and who might bring danger? The estates themselves seemed to remember the violence, the red bricks holding stories that would be whispered for years to come. The cocaine pipeline continued to flow, but it no longer brought hope. Wealth existed, yes, but it was tainted by blood, fear, and the constant reminder that power was temporary. The city had changed. Ambition and greed had rewritten the rules, leaving only those willing to adapt in order to survive. The Red Hawks ruled for now, but they understood the fragile nature of their victory. Every step forward carried the possibility of revenge. Every corner claimed could be challenged, and every shadow might conceal an enemy ready to strike. Even the police, who had once struggled to intervene, had adapted to the new reality. Their investigations had weakened the major players, but corruption, fear, and the sheer complexity of the networks meant that true control remained elusive. Liverpool had become a city of half-secrets, where crime and law enforcement existed in a tense, uneasy balance. The red bricks were witness to both the failures and the resilience of the city, silent monuments to a chapter that no one could easily forget. By the end of the war, it was clear that the cocaine corridor had been more than a route for drugs. It had become a battlefield, a proving ground for loyalty and ambition, a place where betrayal could change the balance of power in an instant. The red bricks of Liverpool had absorbed every moment of it. The explosions, the fires, the gunshots, and the silent fear that gripped the streets. They stood as a testament to a city that had survived chaos and emerged scarred, but not broken. Liverpool's estates had changed forever. Old loyalties had dissolved, new alliances were tentative, and a generation had grown up in a world where violence was a constant companion. The cocaine corridor remained, waiting for the next ambitious players to stake their claim, but the lessons of the war were etched into every wall, every corner, and every heart. The city had endured, but it would never forget. The empire of the red bricks had left its mark permanent, unyielding, and haunting in its silence.